everybody who helped us in these difficult times.
The first time I ever encountered Moldova was in this book, The Geography of Bliss. The author went there to discover why this nation in Eastern Europe was at the time the saddest and most oppressed in the world. Then, in 2010, I had my second encounter. Watching my very first Eurovision, I saw Ola and Sunstroke Project explode on stage in a cacophony of camp, colour, fun and joy. These are the two sides of Moldova. Neither is more real than the other.
This largely ignored Eastern European nation has had a pretty powerful history in the competition, despite being its poorest contestant, second only to Montenegro, having the lowest Human Development Index and lowest Social Progress Index in all of Europe. It has failed to qualify for the contest only 5 times since 2005, had 5 top 10 finishes, and is the source of some of its best known entries, most creative staging, and is really one of Eurovision's most iconic nations. But first, a bit of background. In Moldova, they speak Romanian. It has a shared history with Romania, but has historically kept links with both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. It has therefore been in some way an independent state from Romania since at least the Middle Ages, with Soviet-era policies trying to manufacture a cultural rift between the two nations. It has a history of dodgy politicians, the highest consumption of alcohol per capita in the world, and an awful lot of poverty, making it a veritable hotspot for travel vloggers with sensationalist titles.
Since independence from the Soviet Union, it has been caught between Russian and European spheres of influence, a victim somewhat of its intertwined history with Russia and its struggle to compete without its support. For example, its pro-European government recently got into a conflict with the Kremlin, who threatened to destabilise the nation by cutting off their gas, a move that is very classically Russian. It also has a breakaway state in the form of Transnistria, an area in the east of the country with a high proportion of Russian speakers. It has a former Soviet military base, a very corrupt political system, and the only half-decent football team in the entire area. There is also a continued Russian military presence there to ensure the continuation of peace, and with absolutely no ulterior motives.
But anyway, here is Moldova's story, told through Eurovision. The newest nation on stage in Kyiv in 2005 arrived under bizarre auspices. For the second time, the Moldovan Communist Party had been elected to govern the country, making it the only non-reformed Soviet-era political party to have been actively elected back to power after 1991. Relationships with Russia had cooled following conflict over Transnistria, and on stage in a Kyiv still reeling from the anti-Russian revolution, Zdub, a Romanian-language punk reggae folk band, exploded into Europe's consciousness for the very first time. Now this is a band truly emblematic of post-Soviet musical culture. Their first album was almost entirely in Russian. They made their name touring with Russian, Romanian and Ukrainian bands across Eastern Europe and performing on Russian TV shows. At peace from Bucharest to Moscow via Chisinau, beloved across Europe, this was a Romanian language band, huge in Russia, playing for a communist Moldova in a revolutionary Ukraine. One act that was certainly and simply Moldovan was Orodin Moldova, bringing the Bessarabian party this time to Moscow. It represented a nation where the Communist Party had just won almost half the vote in an April election, sparking a protest over vote rigging. People took to the streets, and in violent scenes a European and Romanian flag were hung over the government building. A fire broke out in the parliament and protesters were arrested, beaten and allegedly tortured. Journalists were detained and put under house arrest, and the mayor of Chisinau appealed to international organisations as 4 protesters eventually died from their wounds. Orodin Moldova is a weird one. Sure, it's very folky and very national in its performance, but Moldova has a weird relationship to its nationhood.
The Moldovan national identity, as it exists today, is arguably a Soviet invention. Moldovan as a language wasn't codified by anybody but the Soviets, and even in Moldova it is not the official language. They prefer Romanian. It only exists officially in Transnistria. This issue of culture, language, and the extent to which people feel Moldovan versus feeling Romanian has been a sticky topic since independence. Often our media here in the West tries to paint it as an either-or choice. Those who feel Moldovan are pro-Russian, and those who are Romanian are pro-European.
But of course, as with everything, the reality is much more nuanced. Studies that actually ask people what they think show that being Moldovan mostly just means understanding that Moldova and Romania have different histories, societies, and experiences of communism. Some radicals see it as an ethnic identity closer to being Slavic, but this is a minority. When we look at how people actually see themselves, how pro-Russian and pro-European you are generally corresponds just as much with personal politics as with Romanianness.
Nevertheless, in times of national stress, radical viewpoints find easy avenues to expression. And in the 2009 protests, instead of being proud of Moldova, protesters were in the streets of Chisinau shouting, "We are Romanian, we want Europe, and down with communism."
The protests sparked a coalition against the Communist Party called the Alliance for European Integration. They promised a new bright European dawn for Moldova after decades of selfish misrule. It went so well that in 2014, $1 billion, the equivalent of 12% of Moldova's GDP, was transferred from the central bank to a series of offshore bank accounts after the nation's three major banks went bankrupt. They called it the heist of the century, but instead of George Clooney and a consortium of high-level bank robbers, it is generally agreed that it was masterminded by a series of Moldovan oligarchs, politicians aided by Russian and European banks. These were the main beneficiaries, the men in charge of the country, its money and its businesses, and the losers were the Moldovan people, who watched state support collapse in front of their eyes. It also coincided with a drop-off in Eurovision, with a run of 3 years without qualification, finishing dead last in the semi-finals in the year of the heist. Eventually, in 2016, Prime Minister Igor Dodon took down the European flag from the presidential building, and in 2017, Sunstroke Project took to the stage once again, rocketing Moldova back into third in the final. Enter Krokorov.
Three of the next four Moldovan Eurovision entries were written by a man called Philip Krokorov. Now, if you don't know anything about the iconic Krokorov, here are some fun Philip facts. 1. He was born in Bulgaria to an Armenian family. 2. He is banned from both Lithuania and Ukraine for supporting Russia's annexation of Crimea. 3. He has been convicted for assaulting a journalist. 4. He's written 9 Eurovision entries for 4 different countries. 5. He is the holder of the Russian Order of Honor for the development of national musical art. And 6. He has built a career out of covering Eurovision songs in Russian.
Now, you could make the point here about Russian cultural imperialism, about the stretch of a man like Krokorov choosing Moldova, showing something about the nation being closer to Russia politically, and maybe a more pro-Russian political scene made it easier for Krokorov to work his dark magic in Moldova. But I want to highlight this line from Sunstroke Project, talking about Doredos, a band from Transnistria whose song was written by our dear Philip, and the 2019 entry, a more local endeavour, which didn't qualify. In other countries, whenever an artist goes to Eurovision, they have a lot of financial help and a big team. Anna didn't, it was all on her and she had less support. Take last year for example. Philip Krokorov is such a big star in Russia. Moldova is such a small country that whenever a big star comes to help, it means a lot. Krokorov chose Moldova because this little nation is too poor to really choose its own destiny in Eurovision. In 17 years, they've used repeat artists 3 times over 8 years, because they are really some of the only ones that have enough money to do it on their own. One of Moldova's issues has always been corruption from both sides of its politics, exactly because it is too small, seemingly, to hold its own. It welcomes whatever help it can get, be it Russian or European, to keep afloat and build the state up to compete. Yet time and time again, the benefits of these arrangements keep escaping the Moldovan people and going into the pockets of rich men looking for power in a vulnerable territory. And just as it must sometimes rely on artists with cultural capital built abroad to help it make any noise on stage, it has also relied on foreign power and money to keep it relevant amidst the political chaos. 2019 provoked the next complicated political mess, with a standoff between political parties, institutions and the courts over the relevant legitimacy of a government coalition. I'm going to optimistically read it as the last stand by one of the men that brought the Moldovan economy to its knees, allowing the rise to power of one Maia Sandu.
I have a message to the entire world. Moldova is finally free.
Her political target is once again corruption and Moldova's largely toxic relationship with Russia. Nothing new or groundbreaking, but this time there seems to be a bit more hope.
Eurovision helped us in Europe become aware of this new hope as a punk folk band and 2 folk musicians burst onto stage, not showing a day of the 17 years that have passed since we first met them. In the 13 years since the explosive protests, and the 11 since their last appearance, the repeated failings of Moldovan governors has pushed support for reunification with Romania up to 40%, with the president looking to join the EU, supporting reunification and making hard stances against Russia. The song about the newly reopened Chisinau to Bucharest night train seemed perfect.
This is one train connecting two expressions of the same Romanian heartland, moving quite literally from east to west. The band that once performed at Russia's May the 8th military parade in Moscow, making a huge statement on the direction that Moldova wants to go in.
I think this optimism is awesome. It's great to see, and the European public rewarded it with votes. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia has given this pro-European drive even more momentum. Those in Moldova know how easily the story of Ukraine could be theirs, and even the pro-Russians want at least an independent Moldova. The way that we outside of Moldova seek to understand politics and trends of smaller nations means we always love turning it into binaries. Moldova's choice is between West and East, Europe and Russia, good and bad, the future and the past. But the fluid nature of how a nation like Moldova has represented itself at Eurovision can help us find nuance in how we consider these smaller nations and the wider story of the continent. Moldova's politics was, in 2022, performed on the Eurovision stage, and it looked towards Europe as part of Moldova's own story, but not necessarily Europe's.
But this has gone wrong before. They have welcomed Europe politically and been burnt, as much a result of interfering oligarchs in Russia as it was of passive Western politicians and Western banks looking to make a quick buck. The Transnistria question makes Moldova a bit too volatile for Europe and makes reunification with Romania and easy entrance into the EU a pipe dream at best. But it is now up to Europe to deliver and realise the hope that Zdobzhidab got on that train to look for. We must give support and follow up good words with real actions. Moldova's history has been dark and complicated, but its future doesn't need to be.